Software has never been a major component of the demand spectrum, but now it is, and it's set to grow. So this is fascinating. And again, it's one of these things that has never happened before. So we're in uncharted territory. So it's another example of a new entrant, the type of entrant whose behavior we've never really seen. So we don't know what kind of behavior to expect, how this entrant will behave and act in the ecosystem. And we are going to have to adjust. And this is going to drive the new opportunities and the changes in the future.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter Markets are here.
Welcome back to Weathering Decarbonization on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Hayn Park, Portfolio Manager for Energy Commodities. We'll be discussing how the energy transition is affecting power markets, from fundamentals to their price dynamics and relationships to other markets, and what it takes to trade and manage risk in a more volatile and changing environment for power markets. Hello, Hayn. Welcome to Smarter Markets.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have you here. You've been in the energy markets for about 20 years now, working at companies including D.E. Shaw, Castleton, and most recently DRW, where you were the head of European power and gas trading. So that's put you at the center of the big issues that we've wanted to discuss in this podcast series. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to just jump right in. There's been a lot of conversations around the energy transition over the past few years. In a nutshell, the broad vision for which was that we would decarbonize by electrifying as many things as we could and then powering them with low carbon renewables. So I wanted to start out from the positions you've sat in. How would you assess the current reality and how this has been working out?
That's a big question, and what a way to start this. I would say that if the overall goal was to bring down global temperatures by 1.5 or 2 degrees by the end of 2030 or 2040, then it is certainly not working out. Most modelers at this point will agree that we are not, at least on a business as usual basis, we're not on a path to achieving this goal. So in that sense, bluntly speaking, it's failing. Now, to give credit where credit is due, Europe has done a lot of work. We still have some thermal plant running, and all the industrial stuff is still running, but it has made it a meaningful dent. Although even here, a significant amount of credit may actually go to non-policy shocks like the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID years that reduced a significant amount of the emissions by just taking down economic activity. If you think about the build out of the renewables, that's been very successful in Europe and has a lot of momentum in China right now as well. And this is a perfect example of the saying, you don't get what you want, you get what you incentivize. The wind and solar build out was directly the result of government subsidies, i.e. public taxation, which all your German listeners are familiar with in their utility bills every time they look at them. Some will argue that it was too lopsided, that by incentivizing too much intermittent gen and not enough baseload and storage, we are in problems now. So overall, I'd say I'm pessimistic. We're on COP30. Can you believe that? 30 years of talking about this, and we are still far from stabilizing and reducing global emissions, which is the only thing that matters in the end. And most recently, locally even, we have Germany saying that they need to build 20 gigawatts of gas plant, something that was definitely not of any plan in the beginning.
And when I think about it, Now, you mentioned you get what you incentivize, and I think it's easy for policymakers when they're thinking of incentives to think of the generation aspect. But there's probably few human made systems that are as finely balanced as an electrical grid. So when you think about the changes that are being made and how they're impacting it, what do you think policymakers haven't been thinking about in terms of how the power system works and you'd like them to understand better?
I think one thing that we can definitely say is that the build out and the development has been uneven in terms of generation versus storage and transmission and regulation of volatility, these things. So we've incentivized a lot of intermittent generation and did not incentivize enough, say, storage. So when the power grid has a lot of power, it's almost an embarrassment of riches. You have to pay somebody to get this for them to take it. And when there's not enough power, you actively have to ask demand to cut. And this makes for a very volatile situation. And this is directly the result of bringing to force all this intermittent generation while simultaneously not incentivizing the more steady state stuff. And on top of that, actively shutting down the steady state stuff, such as the nuclear and the thermal plants in a very aggressive way, and not building any storage to transport the power from, say, one point of time when there's too much to another point in time when there's not enough. So it wasn't thought out from a very systems point of view. And the volatility that we see in the markets right now is reflecting that.
Yeah, and these, of course, are just some of the changes that have impacted the power markets over the course of your career. And I'd like to walk through how the power markets and how you think about them have been changing over the past 20 years. And maybe to give that a little bit of a framework around it and some context, I've heard you say that you think of power as a portfolio commodity. So I wanted to ask you, what do you mean by that?
The way I think about this is power, by the very nature of the way that it's produced, has its price determined by coal prices, gas prices, and carbon prices. So it's like a refinery spread or a refinery product almost, like a 3-2 on crack in oil, or even a cow, which my trader's brain thinks of as a refinery that takes an input, corn, and turns it into an output, meat. Power is the same way. It takes coal, gas, and carbon as input and outputs power. Now, this isn't to say that other commodities like gas, its price doesn't depend on other things like coal and carbon in the complex. However, the price of gas is not explicitly formulaically set by these other members and other drivers like it is in power. So the effect of all this is that as power traders, it's not sufficient to just know the power market and its details. You also have to know gas and coal and carbon, where the price is and where the price is going to go for all these things. So a good power trader in my eye has to be an A power trader and at least a B plus gas trader, a B plus coal trader, a B plus carbon trader. And that's a big ask.
Yeah, and we're asking them to be B plus or better at a lot more things as time goes on. I think carbon, particularly in the EU, was the first big area that they had to be very competent in once it went beyond the original fuel source of coal or gas. What does it take to think about carbon emissions prices in a good way? What does it take to be a B plus student of the carbon markets to be a good, competent, reliable power trader?
I think the most interesting thing about the carbon market is how different it is in composition, structure, design, and so on versus other commodity markets. It's all dumped into one bucket called European energy commodities. But I think it has very different characteristics. And first of all, it's not a food or a fuel. It's not something without which we won't survive. It's a market that was created out of a government agreement. It was created by a set of policies, and you can argue that it's necessary for our survival on a dynastic kind of very long-term base because the planet needs to survive. But it's not like food without which we'll starve tomorrow and fuel without which we can't get around and we'll freeze. So it's very different in that way. The second thing that makes it different is that there's only one event in a year where it trues up supply and demand. So every year there's a particular month and one particular day when all the installations that emit carbon have to submit the credits against it. And it happens once a year. The rest of the year, there's no obligation to do this. This is very different from, say, crude oil, gas, or any other market that trues up and has almost like a coalescing of price to reality, of price to supply and demand every single month when the futures market goes into physical delivery. So in my mind, it doesn't get like tightened up as frequently and as regularly as other markets do. And the last thing is, if you think about the way that it prices, I see regular, say, normal energy futures like crude oil and gas and power as very much determined by the pricing is determined by you start about with the spot, which is where supply and meets demand, not truth. And then that price, you propagate it into the future to get a sense of what the price distribution looks like next month, 2 months from now, and so on. Carbon, by the very nature of its construction, feels more like an equity to me, like a share of a company, where from the way that I see equity pricing, you start out sort of 10 years into the future and then figure out like what your thesis is, what you think the company will be at, and then you present value it to now to get the value of the thing now. So it's actually a diametrically opposed way of looking at what the price is versus a commodity market. So I think it requires the traditional commodity trader to think in this very, very different way about a product that really drives fundamentally the pricing of its features.
And how would you think about carbon when you were trading power or running a trading desk? Like, is that an area where you'd say, I have an edge there? Or is that an area where I'm going to try to hedge it, like lay off that risk and focus on the natural gas price or somewhere where I feel like I might have more of an edge?
Yeah, I wouldn't hedge it because, in the limit of you hedge everything, your risk goes to zero and then your expected return goes to zero. And that's not what a discretionary trading operation is supposed to do. But what I've always approached it from the point of view of the view and the trade that I have on in, say, power or other markets better be robust to getting it wrong a bit more often in carbon than other things. So like engineering calls it a safety margin. There's an extra safety margin built into it so that your trade actually survives. Maybe it'll make slightly less money, but it won't materially alter the outcome if you're slightly wrong in the carbon view. I think if you're a carbon trader and that's your job, then you have a different set of incentives. You're supposed to get the carbon price right. But in my world, the way I see it is I just don't want to be run over by the carbon price.
Yeah, and I think some people may have gotten run over last week. There was a lot of strong moves in carbon prices in Europe. It was interesting. We had Mark Lewis on talking about it last Saturday, and we had recorded the episode on a Monday, and he came back on Friday to give us an update because so much had been happening during the week, and so much of the volatility in the carbon price can be driven by policymakers, which probably isn't always the most comfortable zone for a classic commodity trader who likes to think about the physical supply and demand when you have kind of regulatory issues playing such a big part in the supply and the demand. And I'm curious, when you think about the policymaker piece, now we're getting to the point that Mark was also discussing where the rubber is beginning to hit the road in the EU ETS, with industrials now moving to that margin for price formation, whereas previously it was always the power sector that was kind of at the margin. And I'm curious, how do you see this changing power pricing dynamics?
I think it's substantial. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for what Mark tries to do. His is a market that will pivot so fast on a policy change. And truth be told, that all energy and commodity markets are subject to policy changes. I recall having the German government shut down all the nukes after Fukushima. That was an interesting policy change and one that would have a lot of repercussions. But in carbon, it seems to happen a lot more often than it does in the other markets because it is a policy market by constriction. So when I think about, say, the role of industrials in the price formation of carbon and what impact that will have in the energy space, there's this fascinating. I'll go through the way that I think about this. So, in some hours, when the marginal price of power is set by lignite, which has zero gas contribution, negligible or at least fixed lignite fuel price, the only variable cost for the lignite plant is the cost of carbon. So effectively you can think of it as a plant that burns, quote unquote, carbon. And in this hours, the carbon price will set the price of power and nothing else, because nothing else is really changing. So on another level, movements of the carbon price will also alter the incentives of running either a coal plant or a gas plant. Specifically, the higher the carbon price, the more expensive it is to run a coal plant versus gas. So that's what will happen. And this was the design of the entire system, actually. This was the objective. And in this way, carbon alters the dispatch behavior of these plant operators that have this flexibility. So summing it up, in this way, carbon has a direct impact on not only the price, but also the dispatch dynamics of different fuels. Now, Mark's comment is really interesting, that industrials are moving to the margin for price formation. This is such an interesting new development that's potentially on the horizon. We can think about the feasibility of this because it's been going back and forth a lot in the headlines, whether the free allocations for industry can survive, but we'll get to that later. But if it happens like this, i.e. the industrials lose their free allocations and they have to bid for carbon credits in the market, they're entering a market that used to be only power plants. They were the only natural buyers of these things. So an energy company bought the credits, produced power, and sold it into the energy market, all very nice and tight in one industry. Now, if things change, and if a metals plant or a smelter or something is the highest bidder for that carbon credit, that means that some unrelated industry player is setting the price of a major variable cost input for your energy company. Now, how will the utilities respond to this structural shift? This will be fascinating. So the energy transition is not just about thermal to renewables or oil to electricity. It's also bringing together these sectors that didn't have to care about each other as much before, and in a way that is entirely new. So I would love to see you bring on a utility person to this podcast and ask him or her how they plan to address this, what I think is a major shift in the way they do things.
I think that's a great recommendation, and I'll have to take you up on that. I'm also thinking about it, when you think about the influence that carbon pricing is increasingly having over the broader economy by influencing the price of electricity, which fuel is at the margin, how industrial activity, whether it's profitable or not profitable. I mean, it sounds like we could be moving into a world where carbon policymakers have an influence on the economy rivaling that of central bankers. And are we going to have to start thinking about, as an economist by training, you think of monetary policy, fiscal policy, is carbon policy going to get added to the book in terms of it goes from being a scientific problem of how do you internalize the externality and get the price to reflect the social cost. But are we going to have to start thinking about it almost in terms of, okay, now how is it influencing the overall economy and like a fine tuning kind of aspect to it? It's pretty amazing when you think about the influence this could have as it moves forward. And I'm wondering, does any of that resonate with how you think about it?
Absolutely. It's so much more interconnected now. And that's the challenge. Politicians don't like complex systems. They like to deliver simple messages and simple analysis. And voters, honestly, most of them want silver bullet solutions, right? They don't want to be told it depends. It's all complicated, which is oftentimes the correct answer. But it's not a very politically satisfying answer, in that that's the thing that nobody ever got elected on a platform of it depends. So it's a big challenge. And it's all coming from this interconnectedness that we have. How all like it's so it used to be that like, for example, if I just go into the details of how much more things are interconnected. As a power trader, the only gas question that mattered to me, aside from the ever-present angst over the weather, was how much gas was Norway producing. Russia pipeline a long time ago was essentially baseload, so we never really thought about that much. Now, Now German power traders have to care about what's going on in US LNG export. Thus, they have to care about Henry Hub US gas. And thus, they have to care about US data center build out things, which is something that wasn't even on our radar last year. We have to care about what Chinese LNG import demand is. We started to care about that around 2017, 2018. That was a bit of a shift in the market and what we had to learn to be able to trade our markets profitably. So in this way, these are just a couple of examples of how everything is becoming much more interconnected, much more complex, and in markets where by definition, it's very localized, right? German power is German power, but it suddenly now depends on all these things that are ambit policy coming from the carbon that is much more important, as well as interest rates and things like the stuff happening in the rates market that you mentioned. Now, to me, these connections are fascinating. They're often nonlinear. They're hard to model. And anything that's hard to model is a source of opportunity for the right mindset and a flexible approach. So I think it's a great time to be an energy trader.
And a power trader in particular, because it just feels like it's getting right to the center of everything. As you said, it's all becoming interconnected. Power was probably always the most regionalized market, gas maybe second to that. And now we've seen gas globalizing, as you've said, through LNG. And that has its risks and its opportunities, right? It's like you got to think beyond what's happening beyond your own pipeline system. When you think about that and what that means, do you think we're getting to like a real global energy market with power and gas and maybe carbon as kind of the leading commodities? Maybe not carbon since we don't have enough regulation outside the United States to create markets there. But like, what does the global energy market look like in the future? It used to be people would talk about the crude oil price when talking about global energy. What will we be talking about in 10 years, maybe?
I think it's going to be a lot more nuanced. It used to be that the only driver of variation of, say, petrol prices from one region to another was government taxes and subsidies and things like this. For more or less the input crude price, although there are variations on the weight and the sulfur content and heaviness and all these things, they're still more or less more similar to each other than they are different. So there was at least like a unifying baseline for that activity, which was petrol for moving around. Now, as we go into all these interconnects and energy transition and things, there's more than one way to move around now. I can still do it the old way, which is internal combustion engine using petrol that has been refined via processes. Now, however, I can also run it basically on coal. So if I'm someplace where electricity is predominantly produced by coal, I really have a coal-fired car is what I have. If I'm in a place where it's predominantly renewables, I have something that's run by wind. So when you give the market like different ways to accomplish the same thing that we're trying to get to, which is move around and go to work, there's a lot more variation that needs to be addressed to trade well. There's a lot more interconnects to things. There's a lot more switching capacity because people on the ground are going to make economic decisions about whether to take the ICE car or the electric car or a hybrid or ride a bicycle. Who knows? It's much more rich in terms of that fabric, and it requires a level of high sophistication and analysis, and as well as appreciation for all these sort of interstitial relationships across all the different markets.
And you brought up the last commodity I wanted to add to the list of things that power traders need to be at least B plus in, which is wind. You know, with the installation of more renewable generation, predominantly wind and solar, what do power traders and what do the rest of us need to understand about how that's affecting power prices and power pricing dynamics?
I'll start out with the ratepayers view first, like us, right? The ones that are paying our power bills. As voters, we were promised that renewables are free, right? And our power bills were going to go down, right? Like, remember that? That's a big promise. And well, they haven't. So it's like, I'm starting out from the zoomed out and we'll get to the trading aspect of it. But it's an interesting opportunity to point out how increasingly large this is of a problem for politicians as they face an angry public about how the energy transition was sold to them. This is an interesting topic in its own right as well. So an honest dialogue over the cost and benefit of this energy transition is long overdue, as well as an examination of how we've done it. Now, when we zoom into the physical network aspect of it, the main effect that we've seen in the transition so far is the build out of the renewables over storage. That's been to increase volatility. So we've had to deal with a lot more volatility in the short term. When the market is long, it's very, very long now, and you have to pay people a lot of money to take the power. And power systems are not such that if you have excess power, you can't take a plug and shove it into the ground. It doesn't work that way. If any times your supply and demand is imbalanced more than a fraction of a percent, the grid actually becomes unstable and it goes down. So you have to find ways fast in on order of milli and microseconds to deal with this volatility. And when the market is short, it's very, very short. And you have to ask people to turn off factories to keep the lights on. So there's a lot more of this management for the physical people to manage the actual physical volatility and keep the lights on. And then, since this physical volatility is driving futures pricing in the futures markets, as traders and as market participants, we have to manage that volatility as well. And one of the biggest drivers is wind, like you point out. And that's tough because, well, yes and no. On one end, weather is one of the few remaining mean reverting processes that actually still exist. There's a drift to temperature, like our winters are getting warmer, and we see that as an effect of climate change. The jury is still out on wind. So there's a lot of volatility that comes in from there. It's mean reverting, but there's a lot of variation in between. And if you've ever sailed or windsurfed, it could be perfectly still where I am, and a kilometer away, it could be a gale force winds. And that's how variable wind is over these short distances. So it's a lot of this kind of uncertainty that you have to deal with. But let's not give solar a free pass either, because solar is okay. At least you know that it's going to run between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. But you could have a cloud coming over your solar farm, your particular square kilometer of solar farm, and shut down the entire thing. And now you have to forecast cloud cover, which is difficult. Not to mention, if you're in Southern Europe, you have to care about Saharan winds that dump sand on your solar panels. So it's fascinating stuff, all the new things that we have to keep up with. And it drives the volatility.
And it never gets dull. And just listening to you talk can certainly hear that you're a person who has a strong background in science and technology. I know you have a background in physics, and as well that you've had a long-standing interest in market microstructure and how it affects market performance. Is that connected to your background in physics?
It's older. So my interest in this stuff is actually older than physics because it comes from the joy that I feel solving puzzles. So any puzzle, be it a video game or those intertwined metal rod things or murder mystery dinners, I'm not particular to any kind. I just love puzzles. And that's what originally led me into physics. And this love of puzzles still drives my core today. But for sure, energy transition policy drives changes in the microstructure of markets. And it's a puzzle, a complicated puzzle, like you both pointed out, rates and carbon price and policy and all these things that add up. But to complicate it even more, it's not the only drivers anymore. But wait, there's more. So you also see a significant change in the participant pool, which has been fascinating over the last couple of years. So it used to be our world was traders at utilities and physical merchants. In fact, many, many, many years ago, I attended trading classes at the PJM Center on TSO Basics in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, the interconnection center there. I was the only hedge fund there. And now you see all kinds of different actors from funds and robots and algorithms and pension funds. And this ecosystem has many, many more and much different types of features in the ecosystem now.
And if you were to give some advice to somebody just coming into trading in the power markets with the benefit of your experience, what would that advice be in terms of maybe the personality that's right for it, what they should be thinking about? Just broadly, what would your advice be to younger traders?
So I think the key thing here is be curious and always be prepared to be proven wrong. Because This game changes so quickly all the time. The participants change, the connections change, the framework changes, market dynamics changes. It's constantly evolving. And if you are the kind of personality that excels at doing like the same thing consistently, unchanging every day in a disciplined way, I mean, that's good. That's part of success in life, but you need to be a much more plastic and willing to crumble up all the paper, throw it out, and just remodel the whole thing again because of the way that it changes. And that curiosity to me translates into an intellectual honesty. People who are curious are naturally humble because they have this growth mentality and mindset to them that it's a constantly evolving puzzle that will trip you up every day. So that's the advice. Like, don't get discouraged. Get used to being wrong. Get back on the horse and constantly be learning new things. All these things that we have to pick up on a daily and monthly basis.
And I want to swing to the other end of the spectrum a little bit because there's a lot of people who just need to manage risk in these markets. And managing risk has always been incredibly important and notoriously difficult in power markets because of the extremely limited ability to store electricity and the need for the load on the grid to stay balanced. And it's important, right? You don't want the lights going out. You don't want a surge taking over the grid. So even just going back to like price volatility, which can be enormous in these markets, how has risk management in the power market been evolving with these changes in the underlying market that seem like they're just going to create more volatility?
I think the best are constantly tweaking their risk models to capture not only the things that have happened before, that's important, that's your baseline, but you also have to capture the things that have never happened before. And so I think the ones that are at the forefront of this, the ones that will survive into the next generation are the ones that are diligent, creative, and paranoid all the time. And the ones that will get left behind are the ones that are just relying on history repeating itself in some fashion. The history of financial crisis as a whole is actually fascinating as well. Crises always reveal what the weakest points were in risk models. In '08, it was the whole world being on a VAR-based zero correlation model, for example, and which clearly did not work. Now, fast forwarding to today, if we say use the tool du jour and say we only use AI to forecast risk, for example, we're only going to capture the events that were in the training data set, i.e., that have happened before. And so therefore, it's not going to capture the full set of the real risks. So I think that risk management is first and foremost the most important thing. And it's also an area where creativity can be a strong edge. And I know what I sound like. I know how dangerous the words "it's different this time" are in our world. But if you're doing risk management, which all traders have to be doing simultaneously, risk management is by nature a study of danger. And perhaps you should all be looking at the "it's different this time" cases, right? And being scared of the things around the corner that you can't see and you conceive of. And in addition to all the historical metrics that we have and such. So this hybrid system of using history as a guide, but being creative enough to forecast things that have never happened before and stress it against them, I think this is what makes sense to me.
Yeah, with the financial crisis, you're taking me back to, right? The saying was real estate prices never go down. And of course they can. We could have a whole conversation of the history of financial crisis because it seems like it's not doing the thing that you knew was risky. It's doing the thing that was risky that you thought was safe that ends up being the thing that gets you.
That's right. It's also like too much of modern risk management is driving while looking at the rear view mirror. Now, your rear view mirror can be the best in the world. You can have the best data. It can be back tested to like 30 years to like hourly precision. But if something different happens, then all that is useless.
Well, thanks so much for a great conversation, Hayn, and helping us kind of get more creative and see where we need to be more creative as the power sector and the energy system as a whole continues to evolve. Before you go, though, I want to come back to a topic you raised and a topic that Jeff Curry brought up on the podcast a few weeks ago. which is, of course, we've got this big build out of AI data centers in the US in particular. That's going to increase the load on the power sector. I know, and because everything's more interconnected, if you're a European power trader, you got to be thinking about that too. One thing that Jeff raised was that it's also driving more tech companies to make infrastructure investments in the power sector, to be investing in their own generation, their own power plants. And I feel like that's one more change in the market microstructure in a sense. And I wanted to ask you before you go, how do you see the entrance of this new source of demand and really this new type of participant changing the power markets?
Yeah, it's added to the list of everything that is changing topsy-turvy, right? I think the devil is going to be in the details. Specifically, when we think about the extra demand, is it going to be 95 gigawatts of extra demand or 45? This matters materially for those of us who are in the business of forecasting price and forecasting volatility. Do these servers and centers need uninterruptible baseload or can they flex? Massive implications for this. Will governments impose, I don't know, a cute cat video tax because it's eating up too many gigawatts of power and diverting it from legitimate, I shouldn't say legitimate, but say maybe more physical, tangible economic activity? What's neat is that if you think about it, it used to be that the main consumers of energy were residential and industrial and commercial, right? These were the main blocks. This is what utilities do for load forecasting and so on. So all physical brick and mortar hardware-y things. Software has never been a major component of the demand spectrum, but now it is, and it's set to grow. So this is fascinating. And again, it's one of these things that has never happened before. So we're in uncharted territory. So it's another example of a new entrant, the type of entrant whose behavior we've never really seen. So we don't know what kind of behavior to expect, how this entrant will behave and act in the ecosystem. And we are going to have to adjust. And this is going to drive the new opportunities and the changes in the future.
Thanks again to Hayn Park, Portfolio Manager for Energy Commodities. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Weathering Decarbonization. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter Markets are here. Contact sales at abax.exchange to get started. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.